In the frozen heart of England's cruelest winter, two souls bound by desperation and faith began a journey that would test the very limits of human endurance. This is their story. Good evening, dear listener. As you settle into the warmth of your bed tonight, I invite you to travel back through the mists of time to a world both harsher and more hopeful than our own. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let me tell you of courage, of faith, and of the extraordinary strength that ordinary people can find when they have nothing left but hope itself. In the winter of 1348, in a small village called Ashwell that lay nestled in the rolling hills of Hertfordshire, there lived a woman named Eleanor of Ashwell. She was 32 years old that terrible winter, though grief had aged her face beyond her years. Her hair, once the color of honey in sunlight, had begun to show threads of gray at the temples, and her hands, those capable, strong hands that had kneaded thousands of loaves of bread, that had soothed fevered brows and mended torn clothing, were now perpetually red and raw from the cold that seemed to have settled into her very bones. Eleanor was not a tall woman, standing perhaps 5 feet and 3 inches in her worn leather shoes, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made others take notice. Her eyes were gray, the color of winter clouds, and in them lived a sorrow so profound it seemed to dim the light around her. Eleanor had been a baker's wife, married to Thomas of Ashwell for 14 years. They had lived above the bakehouse on the village's main street, in 3 modest rooms that always smelled of yeast and flour, and the comforting warmth of the ovens below. She had borne Thomas 4 children, each one welcomed with joy and prayers of thanksgiving. First came William, strong and healthy, with his father's broad shoulders and easy laugh. Then Margaret, sweet-natured and gentle, who loved to help her mother sort herbs in the garden. 2 years later came the twins, John and Alice, born on a spring morning when the apple trees were in bloom, both of them small but fierce in their determination to live. But the autumn of 1348 had brought something to England that no one had seen before, something so terrible that people would speak of it in whispers for generations to come. The great mortality, some called it, the pestilence, the death. It came from the east, traveling through ports and along trade routes, and it killed with a swiftness and certainty that seemed like the very wrath of God. In Ashwell, it arrived in late September, carried by a merchant who stopped at the tavern on his way north to York. Within a week, he was dead. Within a month, a third of the village had followed him to the grave. Eleanor's children died within 5 days of each other. First little Alice, complaining of a headache and aching in her limbs. By evening, she was burning with fever, and by morning, the swellings had appeared in her neck and under her arms, hard and black and grotesque. She died before sunset on the 2nd day, crying for her mother even as Eleanor held her close, despite Thomas's desperate pleas for her to stay away, to protect herself. But what mother could abandon her dying child? What mother could let her baby face the darkness alone? John followed his twin sister within hours, and though Eleanor had thought her heart could break no further, she discovered that grief has no bottom, no limit to its depths. Margaret lasted 3 days, delirious with fever, speaking to people who weren't there, reaching for invisible hands. And William, her firstborn, her strong boy who had been helping his father in the bakehouse since he was tall enough to reach the work table. William fought for 4 days before the pestilence claimed him too. Thomas himself fell ill the day after William's death. Eleanor nursed him as she had nursed their children, bathing his fever-racked body with cool water, holding his hand through the worst of the pain, praying ceaselessly to every saint she could name. But on the 7th day of his illness, as the first snow of winter began to fall outside their window, Thomas of Ashwell drew his last breath. His final words were an apology. "I'm sorry, Nell. I'm sorry to leave you alone." And then he was gone, and Eleanor was left in a world that had suddenly become unbearably empty. The village priest, Father Benedict, helped her bury her family in the churchyard. There were so many dead that individual graves were impossible. The gravediggers could barely keep pace with the deaths, working from dawn until long after dark. Thomas and the children were laid to rest together in a mass grave with 23 other souls from Ashwell. Father Benedict said the words, "Bless the ground," but his voice was hoarse with exhaustion and his own grief. He had buried half his flock in the space of 6 weeks. Eleanor returned to the rooms above the bakehouse, but they were no longer a home. They were a tomb, haunted by memories so vivid she could hear her children's laughter echoing off the walls, and could smell Thomas's presence in every corner. She could not bear to sleep in the bed she had shared with her husband. She could not bear to look at the small shoes lined up by the door, or the wooden horse that William had carved for his younger brother, or the rag doll that had been Margaret's most treasured possession. The weight of her grief was crushing her, pressing down on her chest until she could barely draw breath. It was on a gray morning in early December, as Eleanor sat by the cold hearth with no energy to light the fire, no will to move or eat or continue existing in a world that had taken everything from her, that she had what she would later describe as a vision. She had not slept in days. Sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought her dead children's faces. And in her exhaustion and despair, it seemed to her that a light filled the room. Not the harsh light of day, but something softer, warmer, like candlelight reflected in old glass. And in that light she heard a voice, though whether it came from without or within, she could never say. The voice told her that her family's souls were in torment, trapped in purgatory by the suddenness of their deaths, by the sins that all humans carry. But there was hope. There was a way to ease their suffering, to purchase their release from that place of purification, and help them ascend to heaven's peace. She must make a pilgrimage, not just any pilgrimage, but one of true penance and sacrifice. She must travel to Canterbury, to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, that great martyr who had been murdered in his own cathedral almost 200 years before. And she must make this journey barefoot, in the depths of winter, trusting to God's mercy and the saints' intercession. Only through such suffering, such complete surrender of comfort and safety, could she prove the depth of her love and her faith. Only through such sacrifice could she earn the grace to free her beloved dead from their torment. When the light faded and Eleanor returned to herself, she was weeping, but for the first time since the pestilence had taken her family, she felt something other than despair. She felt purpose. She felt hope. It did not matter that such a journey might kill her. Death would be a mercy, a reunion with those she loved. What mattered was that she could do something, could act rather than simply endure. She could fight for her children's souls with the only weapons she had left: her body, her will, and her faith. Eleanor had never been more than 10 miles from Ashwell in her entire life. She knew that Canterbury lay to the south and east, somewhere beyond London, perhaps 70 or 80 miles distant, though she had no real conception of such distances. She knew that the journey, even in good weather with proper shoes and supplies, would take at least a week for a strong man traveling alone. For a woman in winter barefoot with no money and little food, it might take twice that long, if she survived at all. But in the morning after her vision, Eleanor rose before dawn and began her preparations. She had almost nothing left of value. The pestilence had taken not just her family but her livelihood. The bakehouse stood cold and empty, and she had no strength or reason to fire its ovens. She had sold most of their possessions to pay for masses for the dead and to buy food during the weeks when grief had made her unable to work. What remained was barely enough to keep body and soul together through the winter. She dressed in her heaviest woolen gown, the one she had worn to church on holy days, though it was now threadbare and patched. Over this she wore her cloak, made of undyed wool, thick and warm if somewhat moth-eaten. She had a hood attached to the cloak, and this she pulled up over her linen coif to protect her ears from the bitter wind. She packed a small cloth bag with the few supplies she had: half a loaf of black bread, hard as stone but still edible if soaked in water, a piece of cheese the size of her fist, a wizened apple from the autumn harvest, and a small leather flask that she filled with ale from the last barrel in the bakehouse cellar. She also took her rosary beads, carved from plain wood, each bead worn smooth by years of prayer, and a tiny pewter pilgrim badge in the shape of a scallop shell that had belonged to her grandmother, who had once made a pilgrimage to Compostela in her youth. The one thing Eleanor did not pack was shoes. She removed her leather shoes, worn but serviceable, and set them carefully by the door of her home. She would not take them. She would not be tempted to put them on when the pain became too great. This had to be a true pilgrimage of penance, a genuine sacrifice, or it would have no power to help her family. Her feet, which had spent 32 years mostly protected from the elements, were soft and tender. They would not stay that way for long. As Eleanor prepared to leave, as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the oiled parchment that covered her window, there came a knock at her door. She opened it to find standing there a young man she knew by sight but had never spoken to at length. His name was Edmund, and he was perhaps 19 or 20 years old, tall and thin to the point of gauntness. Edmund had the look of someone who had been ill. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But those eyes themselves were striking, a deep brown that seemed to hold both intelligence and a kind of desperate intensity. Edmund had lived on the outskirts of Ashwell with his widowed mother, making his living as a laborer, hearing himself out for whatever work needed doing, plowing fields, mending walls, cutting timber. He had never been robust, having suffered from a weak chest since childhood, prone to coughing fits and breathlessness in cold weather. But he was a hard worker, conscientious and honest, and people had liked him well enough, though he kept mostly to himself. The pestilence had taken his mother in early October. Edmund himself had fallen ill shortly after, and everyone in the village had assumed he would die. He had a fever, swelling, and all the signs, but somehow, miraculously or cruelly depending on how one looked at it, Edmund had survived. He was one of perhaps a dozen people in Ashwell who had contracted the pestilence and lived to tell of it. But survival had left him hollow-eyed and haunted. His mother was dead. Their cottage had been burned as a precaution against further spread of the disease, and Edmund had nothing and no one. He had been sleeping on the church porch, living on the charity of neighbors who had little enough themselves. "Mistress Eleanor," Edmund said, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "I heard, that is, Father Benedict said that you were planning to make a pilgrimage to Canterbury, to pray for your family's souls." Eleanor studied the young man for a long moment. "That's so," she said quietly. "I leave this morning." Edmund shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "I would like to come with you," he said. "If you'll have me. I need to pray for my mother's soul." "And his voice caught, and he had to stop and swallow hard before continuing. "I have nothing left here. Nothing to stay for. And I can't shake the feeling that God spared me from the pestilence for a reason, that there's something I'm meant to do. When I heard about your pilgrimage, it felt like an answer to a question I'd been asking." Eleanor looked at this young man, this stranger who was also, in his grief and his desperate need for purpose, so much like herself. She thought about traveling alone, about the dangers that awaited a woman walking the roads without protection. She thought about the cold nights ahead, and how two people could share warmth better than one. She thought about the long miles and how they might seem shorter with someone to walk beside, someone to speak to when the darkness became too heavy. "Can you walk barefoot?" she asked. "This is a pilgrimage of penance, not a pleasant journey. I go without shoes, trusting to God's mercy to see me through. I can't make it easier than that, not if it's to have meaning." Edmund didn't hesitate. He bent down and removed his own shoes, rough leather boots that had been patched many times and were coming apart at the seams, but were still better than nothing. He set them on the ground beside Eleanor's door. "I'll walk as you walk," he said, "barefoot and in faith." And so it was that, on the morning of December 8th, in the year of our Lord 1348, two barefoot pilgrims set out from the village of Ashwell on a journey that would test every fiber of their being. Eleanor of Ashwell, the baker's widow who had buried her entire family, and Edmund the laborer, the young man who had survived the pestilence only to find himself alone in the world. They walked side by side out of the village as the sun rose pale and weak over the frozen fields, their breath plumbing white in the frigid air, their bare feet already aching from the cold. The first steps were the hardest. Eleanor had expected pain, but the reality of bare feet on frozen ground was worse than anything she had imagined. The packed earth of the village street was hard as stone, and in places it was covered with a thin layer of ice that cracked beneath her weight and cut into her soles like tiny knives. She could feel every pebble, every frozen rut, every sharp edge. Within minutes, her feet were numb with cold, which was both a blessing and a curse. The numbness dulled the pain, but it also made her clumsy, unable to feel where she was placing her feet until her full weight was upon them. Edmund fared no better. He limped slightly, favoring his right foot where he had stepped on something sharp in the first 100 yards. Alina could see a thin trail of blood in the snow where he walked, dark against the white. But when she asked if he needed to stop, he shook his head stubbornly. "We've barely begun," he said. "If I stop for every pain now, I'll never make it to Canterbury." They followed the road south out of Ashwell, a narrow track that wound between bare winter fields. The landscape was bleak and colorless, all gray sky and white snow and the dark skeletons of trees. Here and there they passed abandoned farms, their owners dead of the pestilence, their fields gone to seed, their animals wandered off or dead themselves. Death had swept through this part of England like a scythe through wheat, and everywhere bore the marks of its passing. By midday, both Alina and Edmund's feet were bleeding freely. The initial numbness had given way to a burning, throbbing agony that made every step a conscious act of will. Alina's feet had developed raw patches on the heels and balls, places where the skin had simply worn away to reveal the tender flesh beneath. Edmund had a deep cut across the arch of his left foot that wouldn't stop bleeding, and he left red footprints in the snow. They stopped beside a small stream to rest and tend their wounds. The water in the stream was flowing but bitterly cold, and when Alina bathed her feet in it, the pain was so intense she nearly cried out. But the cold water cleaned the wounds and stopped some of the bleeding. Edmund tore strips from the hem of his tunic and wrapped them around his feet, padding the worst of the cuts. It helped, but not much. The cloth became soaked with blood and water within minutes of resuming their journey. That first day, they managed to walk perhaps 7 miles before the early winter darkness forced them to seek shelter. They were still in familiar territory, not far from villages Alina knew by name, if not by personal acquaintance. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and rose, they approached a small hamlet called Newnham. Alina could see smoke rising from the cottages and could smell cooking fires and the warm scent of baking bread. Her stomach clenched with hunger. She had not eaten since the previous evening, and the day's exertion had awakened an appetite that grief had long suppressed. Edmund approached one of the larger cottages and knocked on the door. When a woman opened it, a stout, suspicious-looking matron with flour on her apron, Edmund explained that they were pilgrims traveling to Canterbury, seeking shelter for the night and perhaps a bit of food. The woman looked them up and down, taking in their bare, bleeding feet, their thin faces, their shabby clothing. Her expression softened slightly. "Pilgrims, is it?" she said. "Well, I suppose that's a worthy thing. The barn's out back. You can sleep in the hay if you like. It's warm enough with the animals. And I'll bring you some supper, though it won't be much. Times are hard, as you well know." The barn was indeed warm compared to the freezing night air outside. It smelled of hay and manure and the sweet breath of cattle. There were 2 cows, a dozen sheep, and a scattered flock of chickens roosting in the rafters. Eleanor and Edmund found a spot in the far corner, away from the animals, and burrowed into the loose hay. It pricked and scratched through their clothing, but it was blessedly soft compared to the frozen ground, and it held warmth like a blanket. The matron was as good as her word. She brought them a simple supper of barley pottage, thick and hot, with chunks of turnip and onion, and 2 pieces of dark rye bread. It was peasant food, the most basic of meals, but to Eleanor it tasted like a feast. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, feeling the warmth spread through her body. Edmund ate with the rapid, desperate hunger of a young man who had been half-starved for weeks. When they had finished, the matron took back the wooden bowls and wished them well on their journey. "You're brave folk," she said. "Or mad. Probably both. But I'll pray for you, and may St. Thomas watch over you." That night, lying in the hay with the quiet sounds of the animals around them, Eleanor and Edmund talked for the first time about the losses that had brought them to this journey. Eleanor spoke of her children, of Thomas, of the life she had built over 14 years and watched crumble in a matter of weeks. She spoke of the empty rooms above the bakehouse, of the unbearable weight of silence where once there had been laughter. She cried as she spoke, not the wild, tearing sobs of fresh grief, but a quieter, deeper weeping that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Edmund listened without interruption, and when she had finished, he told his own story. He spoke of his mother, a gentle woman who had never recovered from his father's death years before. He spoke of nursing her through the pestilence, of watching the life drain from her eyes, of his own illness and his confusion when he woke one morning to find the fever broken, the swelling subsiding, his body determined to live even though his heart wanted to die with his mother. He spoke of the guilt he felt at surviving, the sense that he should have died with her, that his survival was somehow a betrayal. "But then I thought," Edmund said quietly, "that maybe God spared me because there was something I still needed to do. Maybe my mother's soul was waiting for me to do something to help her. When I heard about your pilgrimage, it felt right. It felt like the answer I'd been looking for." They were silent for a while after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Eleanor said, "We're going to help them. Both of us. We're going to walk every mile, bear every pain, and we're going to reach Canterbury. And when we pray at St. Thomas's shrine, our prayers will have power because we'll have earned them with our suffering. That's what I believe. That's what keeps me walking." "Then I'll believe it too," Edmund said. "And I'll walk every step with you, Mistress Eleanor, until we reach the end." In the darkness of the barn, with the gentle sounds of the animals breathing around them, the 2 pilgrims found a measure of peace. Tomorrow would bring new pain, new challenges, new miles of frozen road. But for tonight, they were warm and fed and no longer quite so alone in their grief. They rose before dawn the next morning, stiff and sore. Eleanor's feet had swollen during the night, and the cloth wrappings that Edmund had applied the day before were stuck to his wounds with dried blood. They helped each other remove the makeshift bandages as gently as possible, though it still brought tears to their eyes. The wounds looked ugly in the gray pre-dawn light, raw and inflamed, oozing clear fluid mixed with blood. But there was no sign of the putrefaction they both feared, no foul smell or blackening of the flesh. The wounds were clean, if terribly painful. They rewrapped their feet with fresh strips torn from their clothing and set out again as the first light touched the eastern horizon. This second day was in many ways harder than the first. The initial determination and almost euphoric sense of purpose that had carried them through the previous day had faded, leaving only the grinding reality of pain and cold and exhaustion. Every step hurts. Every mile seemed twice as long as it should be. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, an infinite ribbon of suffering. By mid-morning, they had reached the town of Royston, a market town that stood at the crossroads of several important routes. Even in winter, even in the aftermath of the pestilence, Royston bustled with a kind of subdued activity. There were fewer people than there would have been a year ago. The death had taken its toll here as everywhere, but life continued. Merchants sold their goods, travelers stopped at the inns, the church bell rang the hours. Eleanor and Edmund walked through the town's main street, acutely conscious of the stares they attracted. Two barefoot figures in winter, their feet wrapped in bloody rags, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. They were a sight that drew both curiosity and pity. Some people crossed themselves as the pilgrims passed. Whether in respect or to ward off ill fortune, it was impossible to say. Others simply looked away, unwilling to acknowledge suffering they were powerless to relieve. Near the town church, they encountered a group of monks from a nearby priory. The monks were collecting alms for their house, which had been hard hit by the pestilence. Half their community had died, including their prior. When the eldest of the monks, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, saw Eleanor and Edmund, he stopped them. "You're pilgrims," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Where are you bound?" "Canterbury," Eleanor said. "To the shrine of St. Thomas Becket." The monks' eyes went to their bare, bleeding feet, then back to their faces. "You go barefoot." "In winter." "As penance," Edmund said. "For the souls of our dead." The monk was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression, a kind of recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "The pestilence?" he asked gently. "The pestilence," Eleanor confirmed. "My husband and 4 children. His mother. And so many others." The monk nodded slowly. "We lost 23 brothers," he said. "Good men, holy men. Gone in a matter of weeks. The whole world seems to be dying." He reached into the leather bag he carried and pulled out a small loaf of bread and a piece of dried fish. "Take this," he said, pressing the food into Eleanor's hands. "And know that we will pray for you. And for those you've lost. God sees your sacrifice. St. Thomas sees it. Your journey is a holy thing." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, brother," she managed to say. "Thank you." The monk blessed them both. making the sign of the cross in the air before them, and then the monks continued on their way. Eleanor and Edmund stood for a moment in the cold street, holding the precious food, feeling less alone than they had since leaving Ashwell. They ate the bread and fish as they walked, making it last, savoring every bite. The food gave them renewed energy, and they managed to cover another 5 miles before the afternoon began to fade. They were now nearly 15 miles from Ashwell, farther from home than Eleanor had ever been in her life. The landscape had changed subtly. The hills were a bit gentler, the fields a bit wider. They were leaving the country she knew and entering territory that was foreign to her, and the unfamiliarity added to her sense of being adrift in the world. As darkness approached, they found themselves on a lonely stretch of road with no village in sight. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and a wind had picked up, cutting through their thin clothing with cruel efficiency. They had no choice but to keep walking, hopping to find shelter before night fell completely. Edmund was limping badly now, his right foot leaving a bright trail of blood with every step. Eleanor's feet were so swollen that the makeshift bandages cut into her flesh, and she could feel new blisters forming on top of the raw wounds. Just as Eleanor was beginning to fear they would have to spend the night in the open, which would almost certainly mean death from the cold, they spotted a building ahead. As they drew closer, they could see it was a small wayside chapel, one of the many such structures that dotted England's roads, built for travelers to pray in. The chapel was simple, just a single room with a wooden roof and a stone altar, but it had 4 walls and a door that closed, and that was enough. Inside, the chapel was barely warmer than outside, but at least it blocked the wind. There were no furnishings except the altar, which held a wooden crucifix and a single candle stub. Eleanor and Edmund huddled together on the floor, sharing their combined body heat. They pulled their cloaks tightly around themselves and pressed close, Eleanor's back against Edmund's chest, his arms around her shoulders. There was nothing improper in it. They were simply 2 people trying desperately not to freeze to death. That night was the longest of Eleanor's life. She drifted in and out of a cold, painful half-sleep, never quite fully unconscious but never truly awake either. Her feet throbbed with a deep, aching pain that seemed to radiate up through her entire body. She dreamed of her children, of holding them close, of their warm weight in her arms. She dreamed of Thomas, of winter nights spent in their warm bed with the sound of wind outside and the knowledge that they were safe and together. She woke with tears frozen on her cheeks. Dawn came eventually, as dawn always does, no matter how dark or long the night. Eleanor and Edmund extracted themselves from their huddle with difficulty. Their muscles had stiffened during the night, and their feet had swollen even more. Edmund's bandages were soaked through with blood and something else, a yellowish fluid that Eleanor recognized with a sinking heart as pus. His wounds were becoming infected. They needed to find help, and soon. An infection left untreated could spread through Edmund's body like wildfire, could take his leg or even his life. Eleanor knew enough of healing. What woman didn't, after running a household and raising children? To understand that infected wounds needed cleaning, needed poultices of herbs if they could be found, needed rest and warmth. But they had none of those things, and rest was a luxury they couldn't afford. Canterbury lay still more than 50 miles ahead, and every day they delayed was another day their dead loved ones suffered in purgatory. At least, that was what Eleanor told herself, though part of her knew it was also stubbornness, pride, a determination not to fail that bordered on the obsessive. They set out again, moving more slowly than before. Edmund's limp had worsened considerably, and he was sweating despite the bitter cold, a sheen of fever sweat on his pale forehead. Eleanor offered to find a village to seek help, but Edmund refused with a fierceness that surprised her. "We keep going," he said through gritted teeth. "I didn't survive the pestilence just to give up on this journey because of sore feet. My mother needs me to finish this. I promised." So they walked. The road that day took them through a landscape of bare trees and frozen streams, past villages that seemed half empty, their populations decimated by the death. Some of these villages showed other signs of the pestilence's passing. Houses standing empty with doors hanging open, fields lying fallow that should have been prepared for spring planting, livestock wandering loose without owners to tend them. It was as if God had swept his hand across England and brushed away half its people, leaving the survivors to wander through a world suddenly too large and too empty. Around midday, they passed through a village called Barkway. Here they encountered something that would stay with Eleanor for the rest of her life. In the village churchyard, a man was digging graves, not individual graves, but a large pit, wide and deep. Beside the pit were wrapped bodies, perhaps a dozen of them, waiting to be buried. The grave digger was an old man, bent and weathered, and he worked with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had been at this task for weeks or months. He barely looked up as Eleanor and Edmund passed. But what caught Eleanor's attention was a woman standing at the edge of the pit. She was young, perhaps 20, with a baby in her arms and a small child clinging to her skirts. The woman was singing, her voice high and clear in the cold air, a lullaby that Eleanor recognized, the same one she had sung to her own children. The woman sang as the grave digger lowered the wrapped bodies into the pit, one after another, with a thud that echoed across the churchyard. She sang as he began to shovel earth over them, covering the dead with the frozen ground. She sang until her small child tugged at her skirt and said, in a voice that carried across the stillness, "Mama, can we go home now? I'm cold." Only then did the woman stop singing. She looked down at the child with eyes that seemed to see nothing, and she said, "Yes, sweetheart. We can go home now. Papa's at rest." And she walked away from the grave, the child at her side, the baby silent in her arms, leaving the grave digger to finish his work alone. Eleanor felt Edmund's hand grip her arm, steadying himself as much as offering comfort. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? They were all survivors, all the walking wounded of a catastrophe beyond understanding. They were all doing their best to continue living in a world that had been irrevocably changed. They walked on. The day was overcast, the sky a uniform gray that gave no indication of time's passage. Eleanor's feet had gone beyond pain into a kind of numb burning that was almost worse. She could feel dampness in her makeshift bandages and knew without looking that she was bleeding again. Edmund was struggling, his fever clearly worsening. He stumbled frequently, and Eleanor found herself supporting him, her arm around his waist, half carrying him at times. As afternoon faded toward evening, they reached the outskirts of a larger town, where Edmund thought, though he wasn't certain. His mind was becoming foggy with fever, and he was having trouble concentrating. Eleanor knew they had to stop and had to find real help this time. Edmund needed proper care, or he wouldn't survive another night in the cold. They made their way to the town's church, a substantial stone building with a square tower. Outside the church door sat a beggar, an old woman wrapped in rags with a wooden bowl for alms. She looked up as they approached, and her eyes, surprisingly sharp in her weathered face, took in their condition with a single glance. "Pilgrims?" she asked. "To Canterbury," Eleanor confirmed. "My companion is ill. Is there a priest here? Someone who might help us?" The beggar nodded toward the church door. "Father Oswald's a good man. Lost his own family to the death. He'll help if he can." She paused, then added, "Though he can't do much for fever except pray. None of us can." Eleanor helped Edmund through the church door. Inside, the building was dim and cold, lit only by a few candles on the altar. A man was kneeling in prayer before the altar, and he looked up as they entered. He was perhaps 40, with thinning brown hair and a face lined with care. This, Eleanor assumed, was Father Oswald. The priest rose and came toward them, and his expression shifted from curiosity to concern as he took in Edmund's fevered state and their bleeding feet. "Good Lord," he murmured. "Come sit down. You're pilgrims." "To Canterbury," Eleanor said for what felt like the 100th time. "We've come from Ashwell in Hertfordshire. We go barefoot as penance for our dead. But my companion, his feet are infected and he has a fever. I don't know what to do." Father Oswald looked at Edmund, who was swaying on his feet, his eyes glassy with fever. The priest made a decision quickly. "Come with me," he said. "The priest's house is beside the church. It's not much, but it's warm, and I have some skill with healing. Enough, anyway, to know when a wound needs tending." The priest's house was indeed small, just 2 rooms, one serving as a kitchen and common room, the other as a bedchamber. But there was a fire burning in the hearth, blessed warmth that hit Eleanor like a physical blow after days in the freezing cold. Father Oswald helped Edmund to a stool near the fire and gently removed the blood-soaked bandages from his feet. The wounds were worse than Eleanor had feared. Both of Edmund's feet were swollen to nearly twice their normal size, the skin tight and shiny. The cuts and abrasions had turned an angry red, and several of them were oozing thick yellow pus. The stench of infection was unmistakable. Father Oswald examined the wounds with a practiced eye, then looked up at Eleanor and Edmund with a grave expression. "These need to be cleaned and drained. he said. "It's going to hurt. Badly. But if we don't do it, the infection will spread, and you'll lose your feet. Possibly your life." Edmund, his teeth chattering with fever, nodded. "Do what needs to be done," he said. What followed was one of the most difficult things Eleanor had ever witnessed. Father Oswald heated water over the fire until it was nearly boiling, then added salt and some dried herbs, yarrow and comfrey, he said, good for cleaning wounds and preventing putrefaction. When the water had cooled enough not to cause burns, he made Edmund place his feet in the basin. Edmund's scream echoed through the small house. The hot salt water on the infected wounds was agony beyond description. He gripped the edge of the stool so hard his knuckles went white, and tears streamed down his face, but he kept his feet in the water. Father Oswald worked quickly, using a clean cloth to wash away the pus and dried blood, to scrub the wounds as gently as possible while still being thorough. Eleanor held Edmund's hand, murmuring words of comfort that probably meant nothing, but gave them both something to focus on besides the pain. When the worst was over, Father Oswald applied a poultice made from mashed yarrow leaves and honey to each wound, then wrapped Edmund's feet in clean linen strips. The honey would help fight the infection, he explained, and the yarrow would reduce the swelling and promote healing. But Edmund needed rest, needed warmth and food and time for his body to recover. "You should stay here," Father Oswald said. "At least a few days, until the fever breaks and the infection begins to clear. You can sleep by the fire. I'll share what food I have." Eleanor looked at Edmund, who had slumped back against the wall, exhausted from the ordeal. His eyes were closed, his face gray beneath the sweat. She thought about how close he had come to dying in the pestilence, how he had survived against all odds only to risk his life again on this pilgrimage. She thought about how he had joined her journey not because she asked, but because he needed it as much as she did, because they were both trying to make sense of senseless loss. "We'll stay," she decided. "But only until you're strong enough to walk again," she said to Edmund. "We have a promise to keep." That night, sleeping on straw pallets near Father Oswald's fire, warm for the first time in days, Eleanor let herself acknowledge how close they had come to failure. She had been so consumed by her own grief, so focused on her own need to reach Canterbury, that she had nearly killed them both through sheer stubbornness. Edmund's infection was a warning, a reminder that penance and sacrifice were meaningless if you died before reaching your goal. Father Oswald sat with them that evening after a simple supper of pottage and bread. He told them his own story, speaking quietly in the firelight. He had been a priest in Ware for 15 years, he said. He had married. Though priests were supposed to be celibate, many took wives anyway, and the church often looked the other way in rural areas. His wife, Anne, had given him 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The pestilence had taken all of them within a week last autumn. His wife had died first, then the youngest daughter, then the son, then finally his eldest girl, who was 12 and whose last words had been an apology for leaving him alone. "I buried them myself," Father Oswald said, staring into the fire. In the churchyard, On the ground I was blessed. And every day since, I've wondered why God took them and left me. What purpose does my survival serve? What am I meant to do with the rest of my life in a world without them? Alina reached out and took the priest's hand. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow or trite. But she held his hand, and Father Oswald held hers, and in that moment they were simply three people who had lost everything, trying to find a reason to continue. "Your pilgrimage," Father Oswald said after a while. "Do you really believe it will help their souls? That God will see your suffering and grant them entrance to heaven?" Alina was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know if anything I do matters at all. But I have to try. I have to believe that love can reach beyond death, that sacrifice means something. Because if it doesn't, if there's no point to any of this, then I might as well have died with them. This pilgrimage is the only thing keeping me alive." Father Oswald nodded slowly. "Then I hope you make it to Canterbury," he said. "I hope St. Thomas hears your prayers. And I hope you find what you're looking for, even if it's not what you expect." They stayed 3 days in Ware, resting and healing. Father Oswald changed Edmund's bandages twice daily, washing the wounds with his herbal water and applying fresh poultices. Alina tended to her own feet, which were less severely infected but still in terrible condition. The blisters had burst and formed new ones underneath. Her heels were raw meat, and every toe was swollen and painful. But the rest in the priest's care worked small miracles. The swelling began to subside. The angry red of infection faded to a healthier pink. Edmund's fever broke on the second night, and on the third morning he woke clear-headed and hungry. Those 3 days were strange for Alina. The relief of being warm and relatively comfortable warred with guilt at the delay. Every day they stayed was another day her children suffered, or so her grief-twisted mind insisted. But she forced herself to wait, to let Edmund heal enough to continue. She spent hours in the church, praying before the altar, begging forgiveness for her impatience, pleading for the strength to complete the journey. On the morning of the 4th day, Edmund announced that he was ready to continue. His feet were far from healed. They were still tender and wrapped in bandages, but the infection had cleared enough that Father Oswald reluctantly agreed they could travel. The priest gave them supplies for the journey: bread, cheese, dried apples, and a small clay pot of his healing ointment. He also gave them each a pilgrim's blessing, marking their foreheads with holy water and praying over them. "Go with God," Father Oswald said as they prepared to leave. "And when you reach Canterbury, say a prayer for me, for my Anne and my children. Ask St. Thomas to remember us." "We will," Alina promised. "And thank you, Father, for everything. You saved Edmund's life, and probably mine as well." "Then perhaps that's my purpose," Father Oswald said quietly. "Perhaps that's why I survived. To help other survivors." They left Ware as the sun rose, 2 barefoot pilgrims continuing their journey south and east toward Canterbury. Edmund was still weak, still recovering, but determination drove him forward. Eleanor felt renewed in spirit if not in body. They had survived their first crisis. They had found unexpected kindness. They were still walking, still moving toward their goal. The road from where took them through more small villages and hamlets, each bearing the scars of the pestilence. They passed through Standon, where a new priest was burying the old one who had died ministering to the sick. They passed through Puckeridge, where half the cottages stood empty, and the few remaining residents watched them pass with hollow eyes. They passed through Widford, where they saw a woman scrubbing the front step of her cottage over and over, scrubbing until her hands were raw, as if she could scrub away the memory of who had died inside. They began to develop a rhythm to their days. Rise before dawn, walk until midday, rest briefly and eat whatever food they had, walk again until dusk, seek shelter wherever they could find it. A church, a barn, an abandoned cottage, once even a shepherd's hut on a hillside. They rationed their supplies carefully, and when those ran out they begged at farmhouses and villages, offering prayers in exchange for food. Most people gave them something, even if only a crust of bread or a handful of turnips. The sight of barefoot pilgrims in winter moved something in people's hearts, perhaps because everyone had lost someone. Everyone was mourning, and they understood the desperate need to do something, anything, to honor the dead. They talked as they walked, when they had breath for talking. Edmund told Eleanor about his childhood, about a father who had died in a thrashing accident when Edmund was 10, about learning to be the man of the house too young, about the constant struggle to keep food on the table. He told her about the pestilence, about the week he spent sure he was dying, about the strange clarity that came with fever, how he had seen his mother standing at the foot of his bed, even though she was already dead and buried, how she had smiled at him and told him to live. Eleanor told Edmund about Thomas, about their courtship and marriage, about the early years of struggle when the bakehouse barely made enough to survive on. She told him about her pregnancies, about the joy and terror of bringing new life into the world. She told him about each of her children's personalities, William's quiet strength, Margaret's gentle heart, the twins' fierce bond with each other. She cried as she talked, but the tears felt different now, less like drowning and more like release. On their 7th day out from where, they reached the outskirts of London. Neither of them had ever seen a city before, and the size of it was overwhelming. Even reduced by the pestilence, London was vast beyond imagining, a sprawl of buildings and churches and streets that seemed to stretch forever. The walls that surrounded the city were higher than any structure Eleanor had ever seen. The noise was incredible. The shouts of street vendors, the rumble of cart wheels on cobblestones, the hammering of craftsmen, the ringing of church bells. They entered through Bishopsgate, passing under the great stone arch with wonder and trepidation. Inside the walls, London was a maze of narrow streets and tall buildings that blocked out much of the winter sky. The cobblestones were agony on their bare feet, hard and uneven, with gaps between the stones that caught at their toes. But they pressed on, following directions from strangers toward the bridge that would take them across the Thames. London Bridge was itself like a small city, lined with shops and houses built on the bridge itself. As they walked across, Elinor looked down at the river flowing beneath, gray and sullen in the winter light, and felt dizzy at the height. They had never been so high above water, had never imagined such a thing was possible. On the south side of the river, they followed the road that would take them southeast out of London toward Kent and Canterbury. But first they stopped at Southwark Cathedral, a great stone church that stood near the southern end of the bridge. Inside they found a place to rest and pray. The cathedral was filled with other pilgrims, all heading to Canterbury or returning from it. This was the main road for the pilgrimage, and even in winter, even in the aftermath of the death, the faithful continued to make the journey. An old woman sitting near them in the cathedral noticed their bare feet and asked if they were well. When Elinor explained their pilgrimage of penance, the woman nodded in understanding. "I lost my husband and 3 sons," she said. "I made the pilgrimage last spring, before death came. Now I'm going again to pray for them. I walk in shoes this time. I'm too old to go barefoot, but I understand what drives you. May St. Thomas grant you what you seek." They left London that afternoon, eager to be away from the crowded streets and back in open country. The road to Canterbury was well traveled even in winter, a broad path that showed the marks of countless feet and hooves and wheels. They passed inns and taverns that catered to pilgrims, though Elinor and Edmund were too poor to afford a night's lodging in such places. They passed shrines and crosses marking spots where miracles had supposedly occurred. They passed other pilgrims, some on horseback, some walking in groups, some like themselves traveling alone or in pairs. That night they found shelter in a pilgrim's hospice in the village of Dipford, a charitable house maintained by monks for travelers too poor to pay for lodging. The hospice was simple but clean, with straw pallets on the floor and a common room where pilgrims could warm themselves by the fire. There were perhaps a dozen other pilgrims there that night, and in the evening they shared stories of their journeys and the reasons that drove them to Canterbury. One man, a merchant from Norwich, was making the pilgrimage because he had recovered from the pestilence and considered his survival a miracle of St. Thomas. A woman from Essex was walking to pray for a sick daughter who lay near death. A couple from Kent were fulfilling a vow made years before. And an old man with no teeth told a rambling story about a vision he'd had of St. Thomas himself, commanding him to come to Canterbury. Elinor and Edmund listened to these stories and added their own, and in the telling and retelling they found a kind of community. They were all wounded in different ways, all seeking healing or hope or understanding. The pilgrimage was bigger than any one of them, part of a tradition stretching back centuries, connecting them to countless others who had walked this same road, seeking the same saint's intercession. The next morning they set out again, and now Elinor could feel something shifting. They were past the halfway point. Canterbury lay perhaps 30 miles ahead, maybe less. The end of the journey was no longer an abstract goal, but a real destination they might actually reach. This realization brought both relief and a strange anxiety. What would happen when they arrived? Would she feel her children's soul released from purgatory? Would there be some sign, some sense of completion? Or would she reach Canterbury and find that nothing had changed, that her suffering had been meaningless? She pushed these thoughts away and focused on walking. One step at a time. That was all she could do, all anyone could do. One foot in front of the other, through pain and cold and doubt. Keep walking. The landscape changed as they moved deeper into Kent. The land was flatter here, with orchards and hop gardens standing bare in winter. They passed through Rochester, another walled town with a great cathedral, and Eleanor was struck by how different the south of England was from the north she knew. The accent of the people changed. The architecture was subtly different. Even the way fields were laid out seemed foreign to her northern eyes. They were now 12 days out from Ashwell, and their feet, despite Father Oswald's care and the healing that had occurred, were in terrible condition. The constant walking, the cold, the rough roads, all of it had taken a terrible toll. Eleanor's feet were masses of scars and calluses, and raw wounds layered on top of each other. She had lost feeling in several toes. Edmund's feet were only marginally better, still prone to bleeding whenever they walked too far or too fast. But they were close now, so close. They could feel it in the increasing number of pilgrims on the road, in the way people in villages would point and say, "Canterbury's just 2 days that way," or "You're nearly there now." The goal that had seemed impossibly distant when they left Ashwell was suddenly, almost frighteningly, within reach. On the 13th day of their journey, they woke in a barn outside the village of Faversham to find that snow had fallen during the night. Not the light dustings they had experienced before, but a heavy, blanketing snow that transformed the world into an endless expanse of white. The barn's owner, a taciturn farmer who had grudgingly allowed them to sleep in his hay, told them that Canterbury was less than 10 miles ahead, but warned them that the road would be treacherous in such conditions. Eleanor stood in the barn doorway, looking out at the pristine whiteness, and felt her heart sink. 10 miles. In good weather on a clear road with healthy feet, 10 miles was nothing, a few hours' walk at most. But in this snow, with their wounded feet and exhausted bodies, 10 miles might as well be 100. The snow was already several inches deep, and more was falling steadily from a gray sky that showed no sign of clearing. Edmund came to stand beside her, and she could hear his breathing, shallow and labored. The exertion of the past days had taken a toll on his weak chest, and he had developed a cough that woke him at night and left him gasping for breath. But when Eleanor suggested they wait for the snow to stop, he shook his head stubbornly. "We're too close to stop now," he said, his voice hoarse. 10 miles, Eleanor. We can walk 10 miles. We've come nearly 70 already. We can finish this." So they set out into the snow. The first steps were shocking. The snow was so cold it burned, and within moments their feet were numb. But numbness was perhaps a mercy, dulling the pain of wounds that had never fully healed. They wrapped their cloaks tightly around themselves and bent their heads against the falling snow, trudging forward one slow step at a time. The world became a white blur. Sky and ground merged into an indistinguishable void. The road disappeared beneath the snow, and they could only guess at their direction by following the dark shapes of trees and hedgerows. Other travelers had turned back or sought shelter. They saw no one else on the road, no other footprints in the fresh snow. They were alone in a white wilderness, two small figures struggling forward through an indifferent landscape. By midday, if it was midday, the overcast sky made it impossible to judge time. They had covered perhaps 3 miles. Eleanor's teeth were chattering so violently she had bitten her tongue, and she could taste blood in her mouth. Edmund's cough had worsened, deep and rattling, bringing up phlegm that he spat into the snow. His face had a gray cast that frightened Eleanor, but when she tried to make him rest, he refused. "Keep walking," he gasped between coughs. "If we stop, we'll freeze." "Keep walking." They passed through a village, Ospringe. A woman hauling water from a well told them, and the woman looked at them with something like horror. "You're mad to be out in this," she said. "Come inside, warm yourselves. You'll die out there." But Eleanor and Edmund thanked her and kept walking. They were so close now, so impossibly close. To stop would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that they might not make it after all, and that was unthinkable. They had walked too far, suffered too much, sacrificed too much to fail now. The afternoon wore on and the snow continued to fall. Eleanor's world had narrowed to the simple act of moving forward. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. Don't think about the cold. Don't think about the pain. Don't think about how far it still is or how tired you are. Just walk, just keep walking. She became aware that Edmund was leaning on her more heavily, that he was stumbling more frequently. She looked at him and saw that his eyes were glassy, unfocused. He was muttering something under his breath, words she couldn't quite make out. His mother's name. His own name. Prayers, perhaps, or simple nonsense syllables that gave rhythm to his steps. "Edmund," Eleanor said, gripping his arm. "Edmund, stay with me. We're almost there. Just a few more miles." But Edmund's eyes rolled back, and suddenly his full weight was on Eleanor as his legs gave out beneath him. She tried to hold him up, but he was too heavy, and they both went down into the snow. Eleanor struggled to her knees, pulling at Edmund's cloak, trying to rouse him. "Edmund! Edmund, wake up. You can't stop now, we're too close. Edmund." His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her without recognition for a moment before clarity returned. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so tired. I just need to rest for a moment." "No," Eleanor said, afraid of making her voice sharp. "No resting. If you rest, you'll die. Get up. Get up right now." She pulled him to his feet with strength she didn't know she possessed, the desperate strength of someone who has already lost too much and refuses to lose any more. Edmund swayed but remained standing, and Eleanor put her arm around his waist, taking as much of his weight as she could manage. "Walk with me," she said. "One step at a time. We'll make it together. Just keep moving." They continued forward, Eleanor half carrying Edmund, both of them exhausted beyond anything they had experienced before. The snow had begun to taper off, but the damage was done. They were soaked through, freezing and still miles from their destination. Eleanor's mind began to play tricks on her. She saw figures in the falling snow. Her children, she thought, or maybe angels, or maybe just shadows and wishes. She heard voices calling her name, Thomas's voice, her mother's voice, voices she had thought she'd forgotten. And then, as the short winter day began to fade into evening, Eleanor saw something ahead through the thinning snow. At first she thought it was another hallucination, but as they drew closer, she realized it was real. It was a building, a substantial stone structure set back from the road. An inn, she realized, or perhaps a monastery guest house. Smoke rose from its chimneys, and through the windows she could see the warm glow of firelight. With the last of her strength, Eleanor dragged Edmund toward the building. She pounded on the heavy wooden door with her fist, not caring who answered or whether they would be turned away. The door opened and a man stood there, a large man in a monk's habit, his face ruddy and concerned. "Please," Eleanor said, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Please help us. We're pilgrims. Going to Canterbury. My friend is ill. Please." The monk, Brother John, he would later tell them his name was, took in their condition with a single glance and immediately pulled them inside. "Good Christ," he said. Come in quickly. You're half frozen. How long have you been walking in that snow?" Eleanor tried to answer but found she couldn't speak. Her jaw was locked from the cold, her whole body shaking so violently she could barely stand. Brother John called for help, and suddenly there were other monks, other hands, helping them to a room with a large fireplace, easing them down onto benches near the flames. They had collapsed at the door of a Benedictine monastery, Brother John explained, a house that served as a way station for pilgrims traveling to Canterbury. The monks made it their mission to offer hospitality to travelers, especially in winter when the journey was most dangerous. They had saved many pilgrims from freezing to death over the years, but rarely had they seen anyone in as bad condition as Eleanor and Edmund. The monks worked with practiced efficiency. They removed Eleanor and Edmund soaking wet cloaks and outer garments, wrapping them instead in thick woolen blankets. They brought warm ale mixed with honey and spices, holding the cups to Eleanor and Edmund's lips and making them drink slowly. They brought basins of tepid water, not hot, which would have been dangerous for someone so cold, and gently placed Eleanor and Edmund's feet in them, gradually warming them. The pain as sensation returned to Eleanor's frozen feet was excruciating, worse than anything she had experienced in the entire journey. It felt as though her feet were being stabbed by thousands of needles simultaneously, as though they were being crushed in a vice. She cried out despite herself, and Brother John held her hand and told her it was a good sign, that if she could feel pain then there was no frostbite, no permanent damage. Edmund was in worse condition. His cough had worsened, and when Brother John examined him, he found that the young man was burning with fever. The infection in his feet had returned, or perhaps had never truly left, and the cold and exhaustion had weakened him to the point where his body could no longer fight it. The infirmarian was called, a wizened old monk named Brother Thomas, who had been tending the sick for 40 years. Brother Thomas examined Edmund with gentle, experienced hands, then turned to Eleanor with a grave expression. "He's very ill," he said quietly. "The fever, the infection, the weakness in his chest. He needs rest and warmth and medicine. He should not travel. Not for several days at least, possibly longer." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, tears of frustration and exhaustion and fear. "But Canterbury is so close," she said. "He's come so far. We both have. We can't stop now. If he tries to walk to Canterbury tomorrow, he'll die," Brother Thomas said bluntly. "Maybe not immediately, but within a day or two. His body has nothing left to give. He needs to rest." That night, as Edmund slept fitfully in the monastery's infirmary, dosed with fever-reducing herbs and wrapped in warm blankets, Eleanor sat by the fire in the common room and faced a terrible decision. They were so close to Canterbury. Brother John had told her it was only 7 miles now. 7 miles. She could walk it in a day, even with her damaged feet. She could complete her pilgrimage, pray at St. Thomas's shrine, fulfill the vow that had driven her for 2 weeks through snow and cold and suffering. But Edmund could not now, perhaps not for days or even weeks. And Eleanor had to decide whether to wait with him or to go on alone. Brother John found her there, staring into the flames. He sat down beside her, his large frame somehow conveying gentleness despite his size. "It's a hard choice," he said, though she hadn't spoken. "The young man is your companion, not your kin. You have no obligation to him beyond what you've already given. You could continue to Canterbury alone, complete your pilgrimage, and return for him after. Or you could wait until he's well enough to travel and finish the journey together." Or he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Or you could choose to end your pilgrimage here. 7 miles short. You've suffered greatly. You've sacrificed much. Perhaps that is enough." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. "My children are in purgatory," she finally said. "My husband. I made this journey to save their souls. How can I stop 7 miles short? How can I fail them when I'm so close? Do you really believe that God would condemn your children because you stopped 7 miles from Canterbury?" Brother John asked gently. "That the Almighty would measure your love by miles walked? That St. Thomas would turn away your prayers because you chose compassion for a living companion over completion of a journey to honor the dead?" "I don't know what I believe anymore," Eleanor admitted. "I only know what I promised. I promised myself, I promised them that I would finish this. And Edmund promised too. He's suffering because of me, because he joined my pilgrimage. If I leave him behind now, what does that make me?" Brother John nodded slowly. "Those are questions only you can answer," he said. "But I will tell you what I've learned in 30 years as a monk, serving pilgrims. The journey, matters more than the destination. What you've done, walking 70 miles barefoot in winter, caring for your companion, refusing to give up despite pain and cold and fear, that is the pilgrimage. That is the sacrifice. Those 7 remaining miles, they're just distance. The pilgrimage is what's already in your heart. Eleanor sat with those words through the long night. She dozed occasionally, always near the fire, always within sight of the infirmary where Edmund lay. She prayed, though she was no longer sure what she was praying for. She thought about her children, about Thomas, about the life she had lost. She thought about Edmund, this young man she barely knew 2 weeks ago who had become her companion and her responsibility. She thought about what love meant, what sacrifice meant, what duty meant. Dawn came, gray and cold. The snow had stopped during the night, and the world outside was buried in white silence. Eleanor went to the infirmary and found Edmund awake, his fever slightly reduced by Brother Thomas's medicines. He looked at her with eyes that were clearer than they had been the previous day. "We made it," he said, his voice weak but steady. "We're almost there, aren't we?" 7 miles, Eleanor said. Canterbury is 7 miles away. Edmund tried to sit up, but the effort made him cough, a deep, racking cough that shook his thin frame. When it passed, he looked at Eleanor with desperation. "Then let's go," he said. "Today. We can make it. 7 miles is nothing." "Edmund," Eleanor said gently, taking his hand. "You're too ill. You need to rest. The brothers say you need days, maybe weeks, before you can travel." "No," Edmund said, and there was fear in his voice now, the fear of a man who sees his goal slipping away. "No, I can make it. I just need to rest for an hour or 2, then we'll go. We have to finish this, Eleanor. We have to. My mother—" "Your mother would not want you to die for her," Eleanor said firmly. "She would want you to live, to heal, to have a future." "I don't want a future without her," Edmund said, and suddenly he was crying, tears running down his thin face. "I don't want to live in a world where she's gone and I can't save her. This pilgrimage, it's all I have. It's the only way I can help her. If we don't finish it, if we fail, then what was the point? What was the point of any of it?" Eleanor held Edmund's hand and let him cry, and she understood exactly what he was feeling because she felt it too. The desperate need to do something, anything, to make the death of loved ones mean something. The terror that maybe there was no meaning, that maybe the dead were just gone, and no amount of suffering could bring them back or help them. The fear that the pilgrimage was all they had left, the only thing standing between them and complete despair. But she also understood, finally, that Brother John was right. The pilgrimage was not about reaching a destination. It was about the journey itself, about the act of walking forward despite pain, about the choice to keep living and loving and hopping even when everything seemed lost. She and Edmund had already completed their pilgrimage, in all the ways that truly mattered. "Listen to me," Eleanor said, still holding Edmund's hand. "We did finish it. We walked 70 miles barefoot in winter. We suffered every kind of hardship. We helped each other when we wanted to give up. We proved that love is stronger than death, that faith can carry us through the darkest times. Those 7 miles to Canterbury, they're just distance. They're not a pilgrimage. We are on a pilgrimage, you and me. And we succeeded. Edmund looked at her, wanting to believe but afraid too. But St. Thomas's shrine. St. Thomas sees us here, Eleanor said with sudden conviction. God sees us here. Our dead see us here. They don't care about 7 miles. They care that we loved them enough to try, that we were willing to sacrifice everything to honor their memory. And we did that. We did it, Edmund. She sat with him as understanding slowly dawned in his fevered eyes. She sat with him as he finally, reluctantly, let himself believe that maybe it was enough, that maybe he didn't have to literally die to prove his love for his mother. She sat with him as he fell back to sleep, exhausted but finally at peace. Eleanor remained at the monastery for 3 weeks, caring for Edmund as he slowly recovered. The monks fed them and tended them and asked nothing in return except their prayers. Brother Thomas's medicines worked their slow magic, and gradually Edmund's fever broke, his cough eased, the infection in his feet cleared. Eleanor's own feet began to heal as well, the wounds finally given time and treatment to close, the swelling to subside. During those 3 weeks, Eleanor had time to think, to pray, to come to terms with what she had lost and what she had found. She realized that her children were not suffering in purgatory, waiting for her to save them. They were at peace, and had been at peace all along. God did not punish innocent children for the manner of their death. Her pilgrimage had not been about saving them. It had been about saving herself, about finding a way to continue living in a world without them. And she had succeeded. Not by reaching Canterbury, but by walking at all, by choosing life over death, by helping Edmund and letting Edmund help her, by proving that she was strong enough to survive even the worst grief imaginable. When Edmund was finally well enough to travel, when the worst of winter had passed, and the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the budding trees, they faced another decision. They could complete the final 7 miles to Canterbury, now that Edmund was healthy enough to walk. Or they could return home, back to Ashwell, to try to rebuild their lives. They chose to go home, not because they were giving up, but because they had already found what they were looking for. They had found the strength to continue. They had found companionship in grief. They had found that love survives death, that memory is a kind of immortality, that sacrifice and suffering can be meaningful even when they don't change the unchangeable. The monks gave them shoes for the journey back, good leather shoes, well-made and warm. Eleanor hesitated before putting them on, feeling almost as though she was betraying her vow. But Brother John smiled and said, "Your vow is fulfilled. You walked barefoot from Ashwell to within 7 miles of Canterbury in the dead of winter. You proved your faith and your love. Now take care of the feet that carried you so far. Honor them by letting them heal." So Eleanor and Edmund walked home in shoes, taking their time, stopping often to rest. The journey back took nearly twice as long as the journey out, but it was easier in every way. Spring was coming. The roads were drying. They were fed and warm and healing. They talked about the future, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. Edmund spoke of perhaps learning a trade, becoming a carpenter or a smith. Elinor spoke of returning to the bakehouse, of perhaps teaching Edmund to bake, of rebuilding a life that would honor those she had lost while embracing those still living. When they finally reached Ashwell in late March, as the first flowers were blooming in the hedgerows, they found a village still scarred by the pestilence but slowly recovering. Father Benedict wept when he saw them, having feared they had died on the road. The few neighbors who remained welcomed them back, amazed that they had survived such a journey. Elinor returned to the rooms above the bakehouse, but they were no longer a tomb. They were just rooms, filled with memories both painful and precious. She began the slow work of living again, lighting the ovens, kneading dough, baking bread. Edmund worked beside her, learning the baker's trade, and slowly a kind of family formed between them. Not a replacement for what they had lost. Nothing could replace that, but something new, something born of shared suffering and mutual support. Years later, when Elinor was old and Edmund was a master baker with a wife and children of his own, people would sometimes ask her about the pilgrimage. Did you reach Canterbury? Did St. Thomas answer your prayers? And Elinor would smile and say, I reached where I needed to go. And yes, my prayers were answered, just not in the way I expected. She would tell them about the journey, about the pain and the cold and the fear. She would tell them about Edmund, about Father Oswald and Brother John and all the others who had shown them kindness. She would tell them about learning that love is not measured in miles walked or destinations reached, but in the willingness to keep walking at all, even when every step hurts, even when the road seems endless. And on winter nights when the snow fell soft and silent outside her window, Elinor would think of her children, William and Margaret and John and Alice, and of Thomas, her husband. She would remember them not as souls trapped in purgatory, but as the warm, living, laughing people they had been. She would remember the weight of William as a baby in her arms, the way Margaret hummed while she worked, the twins' fierce devotion to each other, Thomas's hands covered in flour as he shaped loaves in the pre-dawn darkness. She would remember, and in remembering, she would keep them alive. And she would give thanks for the time she had with them, for the love they shared, for the strength they had given her to survive their loss. She would give thanks for the pilgrimage that had saved her life by teaching her that she wanted to live it. She would give thanks for Edmund, for founding a family, for second chances. And she would understand, finally and completely, that the journey had been its own destination, that she had carried Canterbury in her heart all along, that every step she took, barefoot in the snow, had been a prayer, that her love had reached across the barrier of death, not because she walked 70 miles, but because she had loved so deeply and so well. The Barefoot Pilgrims' journey had ended 7 miles short of their goal. But in all the ways that mattered, they had arrived exactly where they needed to be. And that, in the end, was the truest miracle of all. Dear listener, as you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the knowledge that Elinor and Edmund carried home from their journey, that love endures beyond death, that suffering can have meaning, that the willingness to keep walking through pain is its own kind of courage. May you rest peacefully, knowing that the journeys we make, whether across snowy miles or through the landscapes of grief, shape us into people capable of both surviving loss and embracing life. Sleep well, and may your dreams be gentle. I understand you'd like more of Eleanor and Edmund's story. Let me continue their journey, exploring the years that followed and the deeper impact of their pilgrimage on their lives and community. The spring after their return to Ashwell brought with it a kind of cautious renewal. The village, like all of England, was forever changed by the pestilence. Where once there had been perhaps 300 souls living within the parish boundaries, now there were barely 100. Entire families had been wiped out, leaving cottages to fall into disrepair, fields to grow wild with weeds, livestock to wander ownerless. The social fabric that had held the village together for generations had been torn apart, and those who survived had to learn to weave it anew with far fewer threads. Eleanor threw herself into the work of rebuilding her life with a determination born of her pilgrimage. Every morning she rose before dawn, as she had done for years when Thomas was alive, and she descended to the bakehouse. The ovens had stood cold for months, and it took days of work to clean them, to repair the cracks that had formed in the brickwork during the winter, to gather enough wood to fire them properly. But Eleanor was no stranger to hard work, and now she had Edmund to help her. Edmund had moved into one of the small rooms above the bakehouse, not the one Eleanor and Thomas had shared, but the room that had belonged to William. Eleanor had packed away her son's few possessions with gentle hands, folding his spare tunic, wrapping his wooden horse in soft cloth, placing these treasures in a chest at the foot of her bed where she could look at them when she needed to remember. The room was Edmund's now, and he made it his own with the few belongings he had managed to accumulate since returning to Ashwell. The work of baking was hard, harder than Edmund had imagined when he agreed to learn the trade. His hands, accustomed to the rough work of a laborer, had to learn a different kind of strength, the strength to knead dough for hours until his arms ached, to shape loaves with precision and speed, to judge by touch and smell when the bread was ready to come out of the oven. Eleanor was a patient teacher, though exacting. She had learned the baker's craft from Thomas, who had learned it from his father, and she passed on that accumulated knowledge with the same care it had been given to her. "Bread is life," she told Edmund on one of those early mornings, her hands deep in a mass of dough, working it with a rhythm that was almost meditative. "It's the most basic thing we make, and the most essential. When you bake bread, you're feeding people's bodies, yes, but you're also feeding something deeper. There's comfort in good bread, in knowing that someone cared enough to make it well. That's what we're doing here. We're giving people a reason to keep living." Edmund watched her hands, trying to match the rhythm of her kneading, and he understood that she was talking about more than bread. She was talking about the choice she had made to return to Ashwell, to light the ovens again, to continue living in a world that had taken everything from her. She was talking about the small acts of care and creation that make life worth living even in the darkest times. As spring progressed into summer, the bakehouse became once again a center of village life. People came not just to buy bread, but to talk, to share news, to sit for a moment in a place that smelled of yeast and warmth and normality. Eleanor listened to their stories, tales of loss, of survival, of small joys found in the midst of grief. A widow spoke of her husband's favorite bread, and how eating it now made her feel close to him. A man whose children had all died told of planting their garden anyway, of watching things grow as a kind of defiance against death. A young woman, newly married to replace a wife taken by the pestilence, confessed her guilt at being happy when so many were still mourning. Eleanor offered what comfort she could, which was mostly just presence, just listening. She had learned on her pilgrimage that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply to acknowledge their pain, to sit with them in it without trying to fix or minimize or explain it away. She had learned that grief is not something to be solved, but something to be carried, and that it becomes lighter when shared. Father Benedict visited the bakehouse often that summer. The old priest had aged visibly in the months since the pestilence, his hair gone completely white, his shoulders stooped as though under a great weight. He had buried more than half his flock, had given last rites to people he had baptized, married, shriven countless times. The weight of all that death sat heavy on him. One evening in late June, as the long summer twilight painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Father Benedict sat at Eleanor's table sharing a simple supper of bread and cheese and ale. Edmund had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of hauling sacks of flour from the mill, and Eleanor and the priest sat in companionable silence for a while. "I failed them," Father Benedict said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "All those people. They looked to me for answers, for comfort, for assurance that God had not abandoned them, and I had nothing to give them. I couldn't explain why the pestilence came. I couldn't stop it. I could only watch them die and try to get them buried before the bodies rotted in the streets. What kind of priest does that make me?" Eleanor reached across the table and took the old priest's hand. "It makes you human," she said gently. "And it makes you a good priest because you stayed. You didn't run when death came. You were there in the worst moments, offering what comfort you could. That matters, Father. That matters more than having answers." "But I should have answers," Father Benedict insisted. "I've devoted my whole life to God, to the church, to understanding divine will. And when my people needed me most, when they asked me why God would allow such suffering, I had nothing to say. I still don't. I don't understand any of it." "Neither do I," Eleanor admitted. "I don't know why my children had to die. I don't know why Thomas had to die. I don't know why some people survived and others didn't. Why the pestilence took the young and healthy as readily as the old and infirm. I made my pilgrimage hopping to find answers, or at least to feel that I had done something that mattered. And I didn't reach Canterbury. I stopped 7 miles short." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But here's what I learned, Father. I learned that the questions don't have answers. Not ones we can understand, anyway. And I learned that it's all right not to understand. What matters is that we keep going. We keep baking bread and saying prayers and planting gardens and loving the people who are still alive. We keep choosing life, even when death seems to be winning. That's all we can do. That's all any of us can do. Father Benedict was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steadier. "You're wiser than you know, Alina," he said. "Wiser than many theologians I've known. Thank you for reminding me that faith doesn't require understanding. Just a persistence." As summer ripened toward autumn, Alina and Edmund fell into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. They worked side by side in the bakehouse, their movements coordinated by practice, speaking little but understanding each other well. In the evenings, they would sit outside if the weather was fine, watching the sun set over the fields, talking about the day's work or about nothing in particular. Sometimes they spoke of the pilgrimage, of the people they had met, of the lessons they had learned. Other times they spoke of the future, of plans for expanding the bakehouse's business, of Edmund's growing skill as a baker. And sometimes they spoke of those they had lost. Alina told Edmund stories about her children, about William's first steps and Margaret's love of songs, and the way the twins had seemed to communicate without words. Edmund told Alina about his mother, about her gentleness and her quiet strength, about how she had raised him alone after his father died and never once complained about the hardship of it. These conversations were bittersweet, painful and precious at once, like pressing on a healing wound to make sure it's still there. It was in September, almost exactly a year after the pestilence had first come to Ashwell, that Edmund met Catherine. She was a young widow from the neighboring village of Kelshaw, 18 years old and already marked by tragedy. She had been married for less than a year when her husband and his entire family were killed by the pestilence. She had survived, though she sometimes wondered why, and she had been living with distant cousins who treated her more as a servant than as family. Catherine came to Ashwell's market day to sell eggs from her cousin's chickens, and she stopped at the bakehouse to buy bread. Edmund was minding the shop while Alina worked in the back, and when Catherine walked in, he looked up and their eyes met and something shifted in the world. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her face was too thin, her features too sharp, her brown hair too wild to be properly contained by her coif. But there was something in her eyes, a kind of fierce determination mixed with deep sadness, that Edmund recognized because he saw it in his own reflection every morning. Here was someone else who had survived when they shouldn't have, who was still fighting to find a reason to keep living. They spoke only briefly that first day. She asked for a loaf of bread. He wrapped it for her. Their fingers brushed as he handed it over. She thanked him and left. But Edmund found himself thinking about her for the rest of the day, and when she returned to the market the following week, he made sure he was the one minding the shop. Alina noticed, of course. She noticed the way Edmund's face changed when Catherine walked in, the way he fumbled with the bread and nearly dropped it, the way he watched through the window as she walked away down the street. And Alina smiled to herself, because she recognized the early stirrings of something that might, with time and care, grow into love. Over the following months, As autumn turned to winter, and then to spring again, Edmund and Catherine's courtship unfolded slowly. She would come to market day and buy bread, and each time she and Edmund would talk a little longer. He learned about her life, about the loss of her husband, a boy she had known since childhood but never truly loved, married to him because both families thought it a good match. She learned about Edmund's loss, about his mother and his survival from the pestilence and his pilgrimage to Canterbury that ended 7 miles short. "I've heard about your pilgrimage," Catherine said one day in early spring. "People talk about it. They say you and Mistress Eleanor walked barefoot in the snow, all the way from here to nearly Canterbury. They say it was a miracle you survived." Edmund shook his head. "It wasn't a miracle. It was just necessary. We needed to do something. We needed to believe that our suffering could mean something." "And did it?" Catherine asked. "Did it mean something?" Edmund considered this. "Yes," he said finally, "but not in the way we expected. We thought we were making the pilgrimage to save our dead, but really we were making it to save ourselves, to prove that we could survive, that we were strong enough to keep living." Catherine nodded slowly. "I understand that," she said. "The need to do something impossible just to prove you can. Sometimes I think that's the only thing keeping me alive, the determination not to let death win, not to let it take everything." It was Eleanor who suggested, gently, that Edmund might want to ask Catherine to walk out with him properly, with intentions toward marriage if things went well. Edmund was hesitant at first. He felt he had nothing to offer, no prospects beyond his apprenticeship in the bakehouse, no family or property or wealth. But Eleanor reminded him that in the aftermath of the pestilence, the old rules had changed. There were fewer people, yes, but also more opportunities. Edmund was learning a valuable trade. He was a hard worker and a good man. That was enough. So Edmund asked Catherine, one spring morning with apple blossoms drifting like snow through the air, if she would consider walking out with him. And Catherine, who had thought she might never feel anything for anyone again after the numbness that followed her husband's death, found herself saying yes. Their courtship was different from the courtships of before the pestilence. There was less formality, less concern with property and family connections and social standing. The death had leveled many of those distinctions and had left survivors with a clearer understanding of what mattered. What mattered was finding someone you could talk to in the dark hours of the night when the memories became too heavy. What mattered was finding someone who understood grief without needing it explained. What mattered was finding someone to walk beside through whatever came next. By midsummer, Edmund and Catherine were betrothed, and by autumn they were married in Ashwell's church by Father Benedict. It was a small wedding. There weren't enough people left in the village for large celebrations, but it was joyful in its way. Eleanor baked the wedding bread herself, a special loaf studded with fruits and nuts and blessed by the priest. The handful of guests who attended raised cups of ale and wished the young couple health and happiness, and many children to replace those lost. Eleanor watched Edmund and Catherine exchange their vows, watched them promise to love and honor each other for as long as they both should live, and she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Joy, certainly, for Edmund, who had become like a son to her, hope for their future together, but also a sharp pang of grief, remembering her own wedding to Thomas, remembering the dreams they had shared and the life they had built and lost. That night, after the wedding feast, Elinor sat alone in her room above the bakehouse and allowed herself to weep. She wept for Thomas and for her children. She wept for the life she had lost and would never have again. She wept for the years she had thought stretched ahead of her, years of watching William and Margaret and the twins grow up, years of growing old with Thomas beside her. All of it gone, wiped away in a few terrible weeks. But when the tears finally subsided, Elinor found that she was not crushed by her grief. She was still standing. She was still breathing. She was still capable of joy, still capable of caring about others, still capable of looking toward the future, even if it was a different future than the one she had imagined. The pilgrimage had taught her that. The long walk through the snow, the pain and cold and fear and determination, all of it had taught her that she was stronger than she knew, that she could survive anything. That love doesn't end with death. Edmund and Catherine moved into the room that had been Edmund's, and they made it their own. Elinor gave them privacy, gave them space to build their marriage, but she was always there if they needed her, offering advice when asked, sharing her knowledge of running a household, helping Catherine learn the rhythms of life in a bakehouse. And slowly, carefully, they built something together, not quite a family, not in the traditional sense, but something close. A household bound together by choice and circumstance and mutual care. The following spring, Catherine discovered she was with child. The news brought both joy and terror. So many women had died in childbirth, and the pestilence had made everyone aware of how fragile life truly was. But Catherine carried the baby through summer and into autumn, growing round and healthy, and Elinor found herself invested in this new life in a way that surprised her. She began to prepare for the baby's arrival, gathering supplies, making tiny garments, setting aside soft cloths for swaddling. It was painful, reopening memories of her own children's births, but it was also healing in its way. This baby would not replace the children she had lost. Nothing could ever do that. But this baby was a new beginning, a sign that life continued, that hope was possible even in the aftermath of tragedy. Catherine's labor began on a cold November evening, almost exactly 2 years after Elinor and Edmund had returned from their pilgrimage. Elinor had assisted at births before. Most women had. It was part of the expected knowledge of running a household. But she had never felt so personally invested. She stayed with Catherine through the long night, helping her breathe through the pains, wiping her forehead with cool clothes, murmuring encouragement. Edmund paced the floor below, unable to sit still, jumping at every sound from upstairs. Father Benedict came and stayed with him, offering what comfort he could, and the two men kept vigil together through the darkest hours of the night. Dawn was breaking, pale and gray, when the baby finally came, a girl, small but healthy, with a lusty cry that announced her arrival to the world. Elinor held the infant while Catherine recovered, and as she looked down at the tiny, squalling creature in her arms, she felt something shift in her heart. This was not her grandchild, not by blood, but blood mattered less now than it once had. What mattered was that she had helped bring this new life into the world, that she would help raise and protect this child, that she was being given a chance to love again. They named her Anne, after Edmund's mother, and the baby became the center of their small household. Eleanor discovered that the skills of motherhood had not left her. Her hands remembered how to swaddle an infant, how to soothe a crying baby, how to read the different meanings in different cries. She found herself singing the old lullabies she had sung to William and Margaret and the twins, and though tears often accompanied the songs, they were not only tears of grief. They were also tears of gratitude, of wonder that she was being allowed to experience this again, to hold a baby and smell that sweet infant smell and feel tiny fingers grip her own. Catherine was a good mother, attentive and loving, but she was also young and inexperienced and sometimes overwhelmed. Eleanor guided her gently, teaching her the 1,000 small things that mothers need to know: how to nurse properly, how to tell if a baby is too hot or too cold, how to recognize the signs of illness, how to ease colic, how to establish sleep rhythms. And Catherine, who had lost her own mother years before, was grateful for Eleanor's presence and wisdom. Edmund was transformed by fatherhood. He approached it with the same intense dedication he brought to everything, determined to be the best father possible, to give his daughter everything he had never had. He would hold Anne for hours, walking with her when she fussed, singing to her in his rough, untrained voice, showing her the world through the windows of the bakehouse. Eleanor watched him with his daughter and saw in him a gentleness she had not known he possessed. The years passed, and they were not easy years. The aftermath of the pestilence lingered long. The economy was disrupted. There were not enough workers for the fields, not enough craftsmen for the trades, not enough people to maintain the intricate web of relationships that had sustained village life. The survivors found themselves with more opportunities than before. Land was cheap or even free for those willing to work it. Labor commanded higher wages. Old social hierarchies were breaking down, but also with more burdens, more responsibilities, more work that had to be done by fewer hands. Eleanor's bakehouse thrived in these conditions. Bread was always needed, and Eleanor's reputation for quality and fairness brought customers from surrounding villages. Edmund proved to be not just a skilled baker, but also a shrewd businessman, managing accounts and deliveries and relationships with mills and grain merchants. Catherine helped in the shop, serving customers while Anne played nearby, and gradually they prospered in the modest way that hard-working people prospered in those uncertain times. But prosperity did not erase grief. Eleanor still had days when the weight of her losses pressed down on her, when she could barely rise from bed, when the rooms above the bakehouse felt haunted by memories so vivid they seemed more real than the present. On those days, Edmund and Catherine gave her space and grace, covering her work, letting her sit by the fire or in the church, understanding that grief was not something that ever fully healed, but rather something you learned to carry. And Eleanor had days when she would suddenly see William in the way. Edmund lifted a sack of flour, or hear Margaret's laugh in Catherine's voice, or watch Anne playing and remember the twins at that age. These moments were bittersweet, painful stabs of memory that also brought a kind of comfort. Her children were not entirely gone, she realized. They lived on in her memory, in the way she moved through the world, in the love she now gave to Edmund and Catherine and Anne. They had shaped her, and that shaping remained even though they were no longer physically present. When Anne was 3 years old, Catherine gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas, after Eleanor's husband, and Eleanor wept when they told her. It was a gift beyond measure, this recognition that her dead loved ones were not forgotten, that their names would continue. Young Thomas was different from Anne, louder, more energetic, quicker to anger and quicker to laugh. He kept them all on their toes, and the bakehouse rang with his shouts and cries and, as he grew, his endless questions. Eleanor, now in her late 30s, found herself essentially grandmother to these children, who were not her blood grandchildren. She taught Anne how to knead dough, her small hands working alongside Eleanor's scarred and work-worn ones. She taught Thomas his letters, using flour on the work table to trace out the shapes, turning education into a game. She told them stories, tales from the Bible, stories of saints, folk tales she had learned in her own childhood, and sometimes, carefully, stories about the children and husband she had lost. "You had other children?" Anne asked one evening when she was perhaps 6 years old. Eleanor had been telling her about Margaret, about how Margaret had loved to sing while she worked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I had 4 children, long before you were born, and a husband named Thomas, like your brother. They died in the great mortality, the pestilence that came before you were born." Anne considered this seriously. "Are you sad that they died?" "Every day," Eleanor said honestly. "But I'm also happy that I knew them, that I had them in my life for as long as I did. And I'm happy that I have you now. One kind of love doesn't replace another. My heart just got bigger to hold it all." "Did you love them more than you love me?" Anne asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. Eleanor pulled the girl into her lap. "I loved them the way you love the first flowers of spring after a hard winter," she said. "And I love you the way you love the flowers that bloom the next year, and the year after that. Different springs, different flowers, all precious. All loved." Anne seemed satisfied with this answer, and she nestled against Eleanor's chest. "Tell me about Margaret," she said. "Tell me about the songs she sang." So Eleanor told her, and in the telling, Margaret lived again for a moment. And Eleanor understood that this was another way the dead continued, through stories, through memories shared with those who came after. Her children would never meet Anne and Thomas, but Anne and Thomas would know their names, would know something of who they were. That mattered. That was its own kind of immortality. Father Benedict died in the winter when Anne was 7 and Thomas was 4. He passed peacefully in his sleep, and the whole village mourned him. This man who had stayed when he might have fled, who had buried more than half his flock, who had carried the weight of their grief alongside his own. A new priest came from the diocese, a young man who had not lived through the pestilence, and Elinor found it hard to warm to him. He had not earned the right to speak about suffering, she thought, though she knew this was unfair. Everyone suffered in their own way. Not all wounds were visible. But she missed Father Benedict's wisdom, his understanding, the way he had sat with her in her darkest moments and offered not platitudes but simple presence. She went to his grave often that first year, bringing flowers in season, praying for his soul, thanking him for everything he had given her. And sometimes, sitting by his grave in the churchyard where her own family also lay in the great mass grave, Elinor would talk to all of them, to Father Benedict and Thomas and William and Margaret and John and Alice, telling them about her life, about Edmund and Catherine and Anne and Thomas, about the bakehouse and the village and the slow, painful process of healing. When Elinor was 40, 10 years after the pestilence, England was struck by another outbreak. It was not as severe as the first, fewer people died, and it did not spread as widely. But it was terrible nonetheless, a reminder that the death had not truly left, that it might return at any time. Ashwell lost 12 people, including 2 children Elinor had watched grow from Bobbies. The old terror returned, the fear that everyone you loved might be taken from you in a matter of days. Edmund and Catherine kept their children inside as much as possible, away from other people, and Elinor supported this decision, though it meant reduced business for the bakehouse. What was money compared to lives? What was prosperity compared to protecting those you loved? They burned herbs in the house that were said to ward off pestilence, rosemary and lavender and rue, and they prayed constantly, desperately, for God's protection. And perhaps their prayers were heard, or perhaps they were simply lucky, but their household was spared. Anne and Thomas remained healthy, as did Edmund and Catherine and Elinor herself. When the outbreak finally subsided after a few terrible weeks, Elinor found herself on her knees in the church, weeping with relief and gratitude, and a kind of survivor's guilt that never fully went away. Why had she been spared again when others had not? What made her life more valuable than the lives of the children who had just died? There were no answers to these questions, just as there had been no answers 10 years before. There was only the need to keep living, to honor both the dead and the living by choosing life over and over again, by baking bread and raising children and finding moments of joy amid the sorrow. It was after this second outbreak that Elinor decided to make a pilgrimage again. Not to Canterbury this time. She had made her peace with not reaching that destination. But she wanted to go somewhere to mark the anniversary of her first pilgrimage, to honor the journey that had saved her life. She was older now, stronger in some ways and weaker in others, but she felt the need to walk again, to prove to herself that she still could. Edmund wanted to come with her, wanted to complete the journey they had started together, but Elinor gently refused. "You have a wife and children now," she told him. "Your place is here with them. My place was once with Thomas and my children, but now I need to do this alone. To prove something to myself." "What do you need to prove?" Edmund asked. Elinor thought about this. "That I can still walk," she said finally. "That I'm still that woman who set out barefoot in the snow, who refused to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago. Grief changes you. Time changes you. But I want to know that the strength I found then is still inside me. So in the late spring, when the roads were dry and the weather mild, Eleanor set out on a pilgrimage to Walsingham, a shrine to the Virgin Mary in Norfolk. It was not as far as Canterbury, perhaps 40 miles from Ashwell, but it was far enough. And this time she wore shoes, good sturdy shoes that Edmund had bought for her from the finest cobbler in the region. Her feet had never fully recovered from that first pilgrimage. She still had scars, still had places where the skin was toughened and numb. She had walked barefoot through winter once and survived. She did not need to prove that particular point again. The pilgrimage to Walsingham was different in every way from the journey to Canterbury. Eleanor walked alone but was never lonely. The road was full of other pilgrims, and she fell into companionship easily, walking and talking with strangers who became friends for a day or a week. She stayed in pilgrim hospices and roadside inns, paying her way with the small purse of coins Edmund had insisted she take. She walked at her own pace, stopping when she was tired, taking time to admire the countryside, to sit by streams and rest her feet, to pray in the small churches and chapels she passed. And she thought, as she walked, about the decade that had passed since that first desperate journey. She thought about how close she had come to dying, either from cold or from simply giving up. She thought about Edmund, 19 years old and sick with infection, and how they had kept each other alive through sheer stubbornness. She thought about Father Oswald and Brother John, and all the others who had shown them kindness when they needed it most. She thought about her children, and she realized that her relationship with their memory had changed. In those first months and years after their deaths, remembering them had been like touching an open wound, nothing but pain and agony. But now, 10 years later, she could think of them with a kind of gentle sadness that was mixed with gratitude. She could remember the good times without being destroyed by the knowledge that those times were over. She could hold William's memory and smile at his seriousness, Margaret's memory and hear her singing, the twins' memory and see them chasing each other through the garden. The memories were bittersweet but no longer unbearable. When Eleanor reached Walsingham, she spent 3 days at the shrine. She prayed for her dead, Thomas and William and Margaret and John and Alice, and also for Edmund's mother and Father Benedict and all the others taken by the pestilence. But she also prayed for the living, for Edmund and Catherine and Anne and Thomas, for the health and prosperity of her household, for the strength to continue serving them and the village for as many years as God granted her. And she prayed in thanksgiving, for surviving, for finding purpose after loss, for the unexpected gifts of Edmund's friendship and his family's love, for being given a second chance at living when she had thought her life was over, for learning that the heart can break and heal and break again and still keep beating. On her way back to Ashwell, Eleanor took a detour. She traveled to the monastery where she and Edmund had stopped, where they had decided not to continue to Canterbury. Brother John was still there, older and grayer but still recognizable, and his face lit up when he saw her. "The Barefoot Pilgrim," he exclaimed. "I never thought to see you again. Are you well?" Did you ever make it to Canterbury? I never did, Eleanor said with a smile. But I made it to Walsingham this time. And I'm well, Brother John. Better than I ever thought I would be. I came to thank you. Thank me. For what? For telling me that the journey mattered more than the destination, Eleanor said. For helping me understand that I had already done what I needed to do. You saved my life that night, brother, as surely as if you had pulled me from a river. And I wanted you to know it. Brother John's eyes grew damp. It's a rare gift, he said, to learn that something you did mattered. Thank you for telling me. And I'm glad, so glad, that you found your way to healing. They talked for an hour, sharing the news of the years that had passed. Brother John told her about the monastery's recovery after the pestilence, about the new monks who had come to replace those who died, about the continued stream of pilgrims passing through on their way to Canterbury. Eleanor told him about Edmund's marriage and children, about the bakehouse, about her life in Ashwell. And when she finally left, continuing her journey home, she felt lighter somehow, as though she had completed something important. When Eleanor returned to Ashwell, Anne and Thomas ran to meet her, and she scooped them both up in her arms despite their size, holding them close. Catherine hugged her, relieved to have her safely home. And Edmund simply looked at her, with understanding in his eyes. You found what you were looking for, he asked. I found that I'm still me, Eleanor said. Still strong, still capable of walking forward. And I found that I'm grateful, deeply, profoundly grateful for everything I have. For all of you. That night, as Eleanor lay in her bed above the bakehouse, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling around her, she thought about both her pilgrimages. The first, desperate and nearly fatal, had saved her life by showing her she could survive anything. The second, gentler and healing, had shown her that survival was not enough. She also needed to live, to embrace joy and love and hope even in a world marked by loss.